With a lot of questions looming for Miami's offseason, we're joined by salary cap expert Keith Smith to explain the nuances of Jimmy Butler's contract extension, what he could do during free agency, and if their future might indeed be a bleak one. All that and more on today's episode of Locked On Heat.
You are Locked On Heat, your daily Miami Heat podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Heat, your everyday podcast on the Miami Heat. Whether you're tuning in on YouTube, Odyssey, or your favorite podcast app, thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day, Monday to Friday. I'm Wes Goldberg, editor at allyoucanheat.com, here with David Ramil, both of us credentialed Heat media members, and joined today by Spotrac salary cap expert Keith Smith to talk about what the Heat can and cannot do this offseason. Before we get to free agency and trades and all of that, we have to start with Jimmy Butler, who is up for a 2-year, $113 million max extension. We've talked a ton about whether or not the Heat should or shouldn't offer the extension, but I want to get to like the more practical sense of what it means for the Heat, and that's why we brought you on, Keith, because you're the best at explaining these cap numbers, kind of creating these explainers. You know the ins and outs of all this stuff better than anybody else. So if you're, I guess, sitting in Andy Ellersberg's chair and crunching the numbers of what maybe offering this max extension would mean, what does giving Jimmy Butler the max extension mean for Miami's cap sheet going forward?
Yeah, it's important to understand no change for this year. This year's already locked in. He's going to be on the number he's going to be on. What's going to be the change would be potentially next year and beyond. And what happens is what they would do. And I'm going to work in a world because all the reporting is bad. It would be a max extension. That's the only way you get up to that 212 number that's been floated around and tossed out there. So a max extension that essentially it replaces next year's player option with a slightly increased salary, not by too much, about $2 million more or so in that range. And then that adds on a third year at, over $50 million. So what ultimately ends up happening in this position for the Heat is really what you're doing is instead of being in a spot where after this season, you could really start to, I don't want to say clean up the books. That's not the exact right term because I don't want to say they're a mess because I don't think that's the right way to phrase it. But let's just say you can create some additional flexibility. If you were to just let it play out, he opted out, and let's say he moved on, that you would have all kinds of flexibility and the ability to do all sorts of stuff with the roster. But if you extend him or if he simply picks up the player option, however he handles this, what we would see this turn into would be a spot where now all of a sudden Jimmy Butler is in a place where if he signs this full extension, you're looking at locked into max money for him for the next few years beyond this upcoming season, as well as Bam Adebayo probably on a new contract here pretty soon. He's extension eligible this summer, but I think he'll let it play out one more year. We can get into that if you want to, why I project that. But then you still have Tyler Hero on the books. And then, of course, you've got a couple other free agents to deal with and other guys that are still going to be on the books contractually as well. So you end up kind of in a position where you're locked into max money for Jimmy Butler that roughly, just to keep it round figures, $50 million a year for the next several years. And that starts to get a little shaky because it's his age, his injury history, those kind of things. That's where it gets really rough. So I think it really comes down to, do you want to squeeze every bit of blood out of the stone of this group and we're going to get everything we can out of them? Or do you want to maybe start moving into whatever the next iteration of the Miami Heat is?
I think a lot of fans are probably a little concerned about that huge number. It's kind of daunting for especially a player of his age, as you pointed out, with injury and everything else like that. But does the new TV rights deal kind of make that number a little bit easier to swallow in terms of what Jimmy's potential contract might be, or does it not really make an impact at all?
A little bit. Like it's the thing that's hard is it's still 50 plus million, approaching 60 million by the end. So what would happen in that situation is you would be, if you're Miami, you have him starting at a 35% of the cap maximum salary. Now, the good thing is cap projections starting with 25, 26 onward for at least probably about a 4 or maybe 5 year window should be the maximum that it's allowed to go up of 10%.
Okay.
And his raises would only be 8%.
Mm.
So 35% cap goes up 10%. His max salary can only go up 8%. So it does start to give them a little bit, but we're talking a 2% savings. And then you'd see it go from like 35 to probably like 34 to 32 to 31. And that's how it would play out. So it's still going to be a big number. But what's important for people to note is we get so lost in these massive salary numbers. Like I was just working with some folks on some stuff with what Luka's extension could look like when he signs his supermax extension, and we're starting to approach in the final year of those deals. It's going to be like almost $100 million, and that starts to like sound crazy. But the important thing to note is the starting number is still 35% of the cap. 35% is 35% is 35%. So a lot of this, it's just driven by the cap is going up, mostly driven by this $7 billion a year TV deal that's coming in and just increased interest. They found other revenue streams, all sorts of stuff that goes into it, really complicated. Some of it's very easy to understand. But the main takeaway is the league's in great shape. So all the teams are in great shape. So the cap goes up and the players still get their chunk of that money, which is 50% basically of the basketball money that comes in. So that's where it all goes to. So it sounds like huge numbers, but it's still 35%, and then ultimately a little bit less as we go on.
And so if I'm hearing this right, then if any Heat fan that's like, well, just give him the max because the TV money's coming in and we'll be fine in 2026, 2027, what you're basically explaining is, yeah, well, the savings if we get a big NBA media rights salary cap jump is maybe a couple $1,000,000. It's not as if we're going to create some sort of huge gap. There's not going to be some sort of 2016 random cap spike happening for these teams. Am I hearing that correct?
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on with that. So what they did in this CBA negotiation, which grew out of if we're going to find any kind of silver linings in a global pandemic, one of the things was the NBA and the NBPA worked together really well to get through that season and then the subsequent pandemic impacted seasons, and really came out on the other side in pretty good shape, I would say, as a league where everybody's still making a ton of money. And that grew that trust, right, between the league and the Players Association, where now when they came forward compared to 2016, when they're like, hey, we probably shouldn't let the cap go up 20 some odd $1,000,000 in 1 year. And the Players Association was like, I don't know what kind of trick you're trying to pull on us, but no, like salary cap is what it is. It's going to go up. And that's how we ended up with Timofey Mozgov and Luol Deng. Or if we want to go on the positive route, for some, I guess, for at least for Warriors fans, KD on the Warriors, like that's how we ended up with all that stuff. So what's happened in this round was everybody was in agreement. We don't want that again. And we did some very, very loose back of the napkin math over on Spotrac. And one of the things we came up with was if there was no 10% cap on how much the salary cap could go up year to year, cap likely would have gone up about 45% for the 25-26 season. And that would have been about a $60 million increase, which basically means every team becomes a cap space team and every team has a max salary, or not every, but almost every team would have a max salary slot. And that's just, that would have been bonkers. It's quite frankly, I'd like to visit that alternate universe and live in it to see how it played out, but that's not going to be what it is. So 10% cap growth is the capper. And then I'll just real quickly, because people say, but then what happens to that other 35% that should have happened? What they do is they spill that into the next year, into the next year, into the next year until we get caught up. So
It's
you
more
may
gradual.
see, yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah. Smoothing, right? That's what so rather than this, it becomes this.
So then for the
right
Heat,
there,
so basically what to kind of put a bow on the Jimmy Butler part of this, and I do want to talk about Bam since you brought him up. But the Heat, if they were to add on that extra, because what we're talking about essentially is one more year at a lot more money, right? Because that second year, if he takes extension, is only basically worth a little bit more money.
Sure.
So what we're talking about with Jimmy is that 2026-27 season at a $57 million cap number that otherwise wouldn't exist. And I'm looking at your Spotrac salary cap table here, And it looks like the Heat, they wouldn't have cap space that year necessarily, unless I'm reading this wrong. But they would be a lot closer to creating that kind of flexibility as opposed to if they did sign Jimmy to that extension this summer, then there would be zero opportunity for flexibility. And everything that we're about to talk about on the rest of this show in terms of Miami's inflexibility this offseason would basically carry over next summer and then the summer after that. They'd kind of be dealing in this same sort of world for 2 more summers as opposed to maybe just 1 more summer if they were to give Jimmy that extension.
Yeah, I think that's pretty spot on. I would say what the difference would be is the way our numbers work right now is Jimmy Butler is on the Heat, is there. So we don't move players unless it's actually happened. So what you're seeing is that summer of 26, the summer of 2026, he has like a $59-60 million cap hold that summer. So what happens is that combined with Bam's max cap hold, because nothing has happened with him yet, that basically eats into, with Hero's salary still on the books, that eats into almost any flexibility you would have had. Now, well, how I would think of that is, I think of it more if Jimmy Butler is not extended by that point, he's probably no longer on the Heat. So now I would think of wipe that 59-60 million away, go ahead and plug in a max deal for Bam, and then you're basically at Bam, Hero, a couple smaller salaries, and that's kind of it. Now, that's oversimplifying it because 2 years from now, they'll have made other moves, they'll have signed or traded for other guys, but you are in a position where in a couple years, you could have a ton of flexibility. I mean, technically, they're in a position where they could have a good amount of flexibility next summer if that's how they wanted to play it out. If it was, hey, we're going to let's play out we're going to trade Jimmy Butler scenario. They were to trade him for expiring contracts. You're in a spot where you don't have a like overwhelming amount of guaranteed money on next book. It's a little harder because you got Rozier, you have Duncan Robinson probably picking up an option and those kind of things. But so you're probably a little bit closer to this summer, but you could be a little bit more flexible next summer too.
All right, we're going to touch on Bam Adebayo's extension, what's at stake over there, and then we're going to get to what Miami can do this summer to improve the team if nothing major changes. We'll do that next here. We're joined by Keith Smith from Spotrac.
Today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Look, we all carry around lots of different stressors, big or small. You know, we keep them all bottled up and it starts to affect us negatively. But therapy is a safe space to get those things off your chest and to figure out how to work through whatever's weighing you down. I know it's one of the things that I'm trying to teach my son is how to handle stress. You don't tend to think of childhood as a difficult time, but it can be very hard. And so we have to set a better example. And it's one of the things that we've learned through the benefits of therapy. And if you're thinking about giving therapy a try, then give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, super convenient to be for you, just flexible, suited to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire and you get matched with a licensed therapist. And if you need to switch therapists at any time, you can do so for no additional charge. It's really easy to do. So get it all off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today, and you get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. We'll be right back.
Thanks again for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Make sure you are subscribed on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. Help us as we try to get to 14,000 subscribers on the YouTube channel. Hit the like button while you're hitting that subscribe button. 5-star ratings and reviews always appreciated on your podcast app. Keith, you mentioned the Bam Adebayo extension. I agree with you. It just makes a lot of sense for him to sign that next summer. Can you just explain why?
Yeah, so what's happened for him is he is not super max eligible is what people call it, which is the 35% of the cap max because he didn't qualify. The qualifiers to get there are you have to win MVP, you have to win Defensive Player of the Year, or you have to be named All-NBA. He didn't get there, so not eligible. Now, what I would say if I was representing Bam, and I think where his thought process is, probably not going to win MVP, but there's a very real world where he could win Defensive Player of the Year. There's a very real world where he could make All-NBA. So what I would do is I would say, hey, I'm going to play out this year, put it on myself to try to make one of those 2 qualifiers, and then I'm super max eligible. And if I'm Miami, I'm day one that I'm able to, which would be like midnight on July 1st, a year from now, if he's made it, here's your 35% of the cap max extension. Let's go. Because what he's eligible to do right now is he can do 4 years at the 30% max and add that on. But to me, that's not going to move the needle enough. I would rather play it out one more year and see if I make it. And then there is a world where he could even say, you know what, I already didn't make it. I'm going to play out my final year too and try to qualify, because you can also qualify for it to sign. Then it's not an extension, but it's a designated player contract. And you could do it that way. So that's certainly possible for him to do too. That's kind of what Jaylen Brown's situation was with Boston a year ago, and he had made it. So he signed the extension, but there was a thought process of he might play this out and try to, get there another way. So the important thing to know too, that's only eligible for Bam to get from the Heat. No other team could offer him that. So even if there started to be trade rumors or whatever else, if people start saying, well, he could do it because maybe this other team will give it to him, they can't. He's only allowed to get that from Miami. You can only get it from the team that drafts you or a team that acquires you while you're on a rookie scale contract. So play it out. I think maybe next year, either defensive player of the year, all NBA, that seems fairly reasonable type goals for him. And then hit that 35% max.
I had a follow-up about Jimmy's contract. I know we talked about it in the previous segment, but I was wondering, one of the things that we've kind of bandied about here on the show is whether or not they could include certain clauses that would guarantee that he plays a certain number of games, or that he takes them to a certain point. Because again, the expectation with Jimmy is like, you know what, we're kind of okay as a front office that you play 60 games, understanding that typically you raise your game to another level and have carried us either to the Eastern Conference Finals, to the finals. Are those realistic clauses that they could include? And how likely is that you think Jimmy might agree to something that like where he'd have to play a minimum of 70 games, or, I guess in theory, take them at least to the Eastern Conference Finals or something like that? Is that something that they could include in his contract so he could get his quote unquote max money?
Yeah, and before I answer that, I think I misspoke and said 212 million. When we were talking about, it's 112 million. So I'm already in the mega numbers there with that. So it's 112 million. I want to be very clear.
You're just giving away $100 million like
yeah,
that.
That's it. Yeah, it's not my money. I don't care. Build another cruise ship. You're good. So I think with Jimmy Butler, so there's two different ways you could do things like that. The more typical way is what they would do is they'd give him a lower base salary, and then they would give him incentives on top of that. Incentives, though, can only be they're capped at 15% of a given year. So let's just keep it round numbers. Let's say it's 50 million was his base salary. You could only have 5 million or like 7.5 million in incentives. So that gets a little tricky there, but you can do that. Some teams have put those in there. You guys will hear and see me write a lot about Desmond Bane's extension, where I call it's a near max extension, because what the Grizzlies did was, rather than give him the full max, they gave him a base salary plus incentives that can get him to the max in his extension. And that's how that comes together for him. So slightly different approach. But in Jimmy Butler's case, they could do that. The other way they could do it, which has been a more common tactic with older players, becomes you either you make the contract partially guaranteed. So let's just say 50 million to keep it easy. You would say, hey, you're getting 25 million guaranteed, but we'll give you the other, we'll give you 5 million more if you are playing 70 games or 60 games and the team makes it to the second round, and then 5 million more on top of that if we make it to the third round. And you can just keep building it up that way. I don't think he goes for either one of those, because I think his leverage point is, I've got other teams that'll probably just do this. So why do I need to mess around with this kind of stuff with you guys, with giving you all this stuff? And everybody likes to think guys will give all kinds of hometown discounts and all sorts of stuff. I don't. This is not a case of, hey, if you do this, we can go sign, I don't know, we could go sign Paul George. I'm just making it up because he's one of the top free agents. Then maybe that would be a case where, all right, turn some of my money into incentives and free up cap space. They're not living in that world, so there's no real benefit to his side to give anything up. But it is technically possible to structure it slightly different.
I want to look at what the Heat can do this offseason. They've got 4 contracts over the $20 million mark. You got Jimmy at $49 million, Bam at $35, Tyler's making $29. You've got Rozier on the books for $25, and then you got Duncan Robinson right there at $19.4 million. They have one of the highest payrolls in the league. I'm a little confused by where the Heat are in terms of the second tax apron and what is available to them. From what I understand, now I guess once the new league year starts and everybody kind of gets their incremental raises, they're basically a second apron team. Do I have that right?
They're super close because here if we just do it the way I always think through these things is I look at it and I say, all right, what's your guaranteed money on the books? So if you took, let's say, every player with an option and they've got 4 guys with player options, let's say they were all to opt out and leave, and then let's just say they waived Orlando Robinson with the players on the books plus their draft pick, they're at about $167 million in guaranteed money on the books for 8 players. So that's only half a roster. That has them under that second apron number, but by 22 million, that sounds like a lot until you start figuring, well, some of those guys aren't going to decline their options. So that starts eating into it. And you have to still fill out the roster. You still have to sign a minimum of 6 more guys, even 6 guys at a minimum contract. If that's the way it went, that would be 12, 13, $14 million in that range. So now we're down to like 8 million under the apron. And that's probably not going to be how it goes either, because they're probably going to want to try to re-sign a guy like Caleb Martin. I think Kevin Love probably opts in, Josh Richardson.
Yeah.
So functionally, the way I think about the Heat is, even if you add up all the salaries and they're below the second apron, they're probably not going. They're going to have to operate like a second apron team. Barring, if they trade Butler away and bring back half the salary, that changes the math entirely.
Right.
But as it stands right now, just with the players on the roster, you have to think of it as we're going to operate like a second apron team, because there's 2 things that happen. Is one, you are probably going to get there by the time you fill out the roster. And 2, even if you don't get there, if you do any of the things that hard cap you at the second apron, now that's your limit. You cannot go over that at all. So then that's things like aggregate salaries together in a trade, take back a certain amount of money and those kind of things. That's where it gets really kind of tricky. So that's what I think their approach will be. We're operating like we're a second apron team.
Here's a great tease. Wait, David, sorry. We got to tease it. We have a very important follow-up for Keith after this.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL. Go Cats. And FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money line, playoff props, and so much more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shout. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. We'll be right back.
David, go ahead with your follow-up.
Well, I just wanted to know about the possibility of trading Jimmy to Philadelphia, which has been talked about a lot. And one of the ideas is, well, they can accept Jimmy into their salary cap space, and Miami would not have to take back the requisite amount of salary. Is that correct? How would that work? Like a number of draft picks, possibly Paul Reed. What would Miami have to accept back in a trade of Jimmy Butler to, say, the Philadelphia 76ers, if that's the route that winds up happening?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, they could, and this is clearly not going to happen. Otherwise, the Heat need to start thinking about the unthinkable of, whoa, our front office lost it. But they could just say, have him and give us back a top 55 protected second-round pick that'll never convey, or unlikely to convey. That's like the ultimate giveaway of a player, right? Or give us back the minimum amount of cash, or draft rights to some dude who's never coming over, or something like that. That wouldn't be how it plays out. But in theory, yes, they could trade his entire, 49 million and change salary into, or I guess almost 49 million. Yeah. I apologize. To Philly into their cap space. Then Philly and my guess is at that point it would be, do you want any of our non-guaranteed players back? Do you want Paul Reed? Do you want Ricky Council? Do you want Jeff Dowden? There are ways they could work, maybe a sign and trade, where like, hey, do you really want like Tobias Harris? Like, let's
Right.
talk. I don't think so, but let's have a conversation if you want to do that. And they could say, yeah, we'll sign and trade you Tobias Harris for 25 million or whatever, and then there you go. You've kind of cut Butler's salary in half, and off it goes. So there's ways you could do that, but I assume if it was a trade, it'd be primarily draft pick compensation and maybe one or two of the like non-get, maybe a Paul Reed to your point. That could be a guy.
Basically, if that's somebody that Miami likes, like, hey, we really want Paul Reed as our backup center for him, and then Philadelphia,
exactly.
Like, cool. We don't really care about Paul Reed. We want Jimmy Butler.
Exactly. Yeah, that would be exactly it. Philly would be like, yeah, fine. Because the reality is, probably going to have to waive him anyway to fit in Jimmy Butler's contract. So if you just want to take him back, sure. If you're happy to have him, go ahead and we'll go. And that's or that's where you could get a third team in there that says, hey, you guys want Paul Reed, and yeah, we'll take him on or something like that. And
but that would not create max cap space for the Heat this summer. That would basically get them well below the second apron, but they would still be operating as a non-cap space team. So any Heat fan that says, well, just trade Jimmy into cap space and then sign LeBron or something, like, that's not an option.
No. Yeah. So what would happen? So let's say we're in a world where Jimmy Butler comes off the books, and then let's wipe away the salaries, the rest of like the free agent salaries. I'm just going to do some quick math here. They could get to a world where they're at maybe 15 to 20 million in cap space, but it's important to remember you're carrying I'm going to just round it and call it $320+ million salaries plus Bam at 35 million. So well, once you're carrying those salaries, even if I don't see any of those as bad contracts individually, they just all add up, and that's how you end up without having cap space. Because there is a wide margin between having cap space and being an apron team or a second apron team. Like, that's a huge variance there between those two. And that's where I think sometimes people think, well, but if it got us out of the apron, shouldn't it have got us there? But like, the apron first apron's 178 million, second apron's 189 million, salary cap's 141 million. So you're talking 35 to 45 million in difference there.
So I'm going to assume, let's just say, either way, no matter what happens with Jimmy, as long as he's on the roster, he's making that $49 million. I think we all agree. Kevin Love's going to opt in. Josh Richardson's going to opt in. We all believe that. Thomas Bryant at 2.8, we'll see. But that's Caleb Martin will opt out. They are going to have to pay him to re-sign him. Haywood Highsmith, it looks he's in line for a raise too as a free agent. So we don't know if they're coming back. So let's not include them on the books, but we're going to include K Love and Josh Richardson. And obviously Jimmy Butler, he has not been traded. Do the Heat have do they have the taxpayer mid-level exception available to them, or is basically their options in free agency veteran minimum contracts?
Yeah, so here's the challenge. This is where things have changed quite a bit. In the old world, they would have had the they may have had the taxpayer MLE available to them if they were just like at the first apron or just below. In the new world, what happens is if you're over the first apron, you can still use that taxpayer MLE, but what happens is you hard cap yourself at the second apron. So if you don't have the clearance under to use it, obviously you can't use it. And then even if you do, and that taxpayer MLE is a little over $5 million, about 5.2 million. If you used it, let's say you had 6 million in clearance, now you only have 800,000 in clearance. In Miami, well, they've done this dance several times where it's dancing around a hard cap, right? It's we did sign and trades one year, I think, to get there. One year was they used the non-taxpayer MLE to sign guys. So they've gotten pretty good at dancing around the hard cap and the apron. But I think it might even been with you guys where we talked about like, hey, why can't they sign a guy to a rest of the season contract until like the end of February, and they have to wait and all these things? And it was because they didn't have the clearance under the hard cap. So they had to hold on those kind of things. So that's where it becomes, you're basically creating a problem for yourself. Here's the other thing. $5 million. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of money, but a veteran minimum guy, if it's a like 8, 9, 10 year veteran minimum guy, they're actual pay, their cap hit is a little over 2 million, but their actual salary is going to be closer to 3. And a lot of times what you do is you kind of have that conversation of, hey, do you really need 2 million more bucks? Because we might not be able to sign 2 or 3 of you guys then if you need that. And sometimes the answer is yes. And sometimes the answer is, all right, we want the guy bad enough, so we're going to do it. But that's where the challenge comes in. That's why I say I think they operate with the mindset of we are a second apron team just to avoid hard capping themselves at that second apron.
So they will basically, if they do approach it that way, hey, we've got minimum salaries, that's it this summer. And then you mentioned sign and trade before, and I think I got this right, that they could sign and trade a player out and it would not hard cap them. But if they were to sign and trade a player and acquire that player, then that would hard cap them at that second apron number that we were talking about.
It actually hard caps you at the first apron. So it's even
so they
more
can't
restrictive.
So they can't sign and trade and bring in unless something
Correct.
crazy happens with their roster. But they can sign and trade out just fine.
Yeah, you can sign and trade out. What you can't do is, probably the best example of this. Remember when the Celtics signed and traded Gordon Hayward to the Hornets, and they created at the time, it was the largest trade exception in NBA history. And then they used that to acquire Fournier and Josh Richardson with the rest of it later down the line. If you sign and trade, let's just say Caleb Martin, I'll use him as an example. Let's say they signed and traded him out to a team for, let's just say $25 million in first year salary, and that created a $25 million trade exception. They can't then use that trade exception to bring in other guys. So you couldn't do that as like step one and then say, all right, now we're going to go trade for a guy who makes 20 million and put him in the trade exception. Once you're up over the aprons, you're not allowed to do that anymore. They've kind of closed that loophole in this new CBA with the creation of the second aprons. The easiest way I can explain it, if you're a second apron team, here's the things you're allowed to do. You can re-sign your own free agents, do whatever you want to do with whatever rights you have available for them. You can sign your own draft picks. So there's no issue with signing your first round pick or second round picks or anything like that. You're allowed to use second round pick exception, whatever you need to do to sign those guys. You can sign players to minimum contracts. So whether it be veteran minimum or rookie minimum deals or whatever, you can do that. The other thing you can do, you can still make trades, but trades are extremely restrictive. You cannot make a trade where you aggregate guys together. So they couldn't like take Duncan Robinson and Terry Rozier and go trade for somebody that makes they'd roughly make $45 million. You can't go trade for a $45 million player.
So how does that impact their ability to trade for, say, Donovan Mitchell then?
It's going to be really hard. If they wanted to do that this summer, it's going to be really, really tricky because now I'll say this, if there's a team in the league that I think could figure out a way, they'll get there, because when they got Jimmy Butler, it was like, the heck are they making this happen? And then it was like, okay, they felt like 25 other moves to do what they needed to do to get there. So if they were going to trade for Donovan Mitchell, it's going to include probably somebody else is going somewhere in some kind of move. And that's going to be how they're going to do that. And that's where order of operations becomes extremely important. So that could be one where it's like, excuse me, we're trading for Donovan Mitchell. So what we're going to do is we're going to move Jimmy Butler to Philly first. We'll just use that one because that's out there as a rumor. Then now we're no longer dealing with apron issues. Now we can bring in Donovan Mitchell because we're not dealing with apron issues, because we can combine Rozier and Robinson, or what a Hero and Robinson, or whatever you need to do that. So you can't combine salaries if you're second apron team. The other thing you can't do anymore, first or second apron, you can only take back as much money as you send out or less in a trade. So if they, let's say again, Jimmy Butler is going out $49 million, you can take back up to $49 million, but you can't take back 50. You can't take back 49 and a half. All those buffers that were created are gone. They've made it very difficult for teams to make trades when they're up and over the aprons. That rule exists first and second apron. The aggregation rule is there. Last one for second apron teams, just very quickly, you can't send out cash in trades, so no more buying draft picks.
Right.
So you can, if they were like, hey, the best way, we want to fill out with another second rounder if they're a second apron team, you can't do that. And if you do use cash, you get hard capped at the second apron.
Jeez.
So I've got
Miami's got it screwed.
Well, I've got two hypotheticals for you then, based on so number one, let me ask you this first. On draft night, right? That's before the new league calendar starts on July 1st, right?
Sure.
So can they do these things maybe on draft night, July 27th, or do they still have to operate as a second apron team?
Yeah, you can't. So what they did was they changed the rules in the CBA specifically to block this. So what happens is you have to operate at whatever status you're at or will be at post trades as of the end of your season. So Miami season ended. Miami's now restricted to doing that. So if they could make a trade today, right? We know that it's working.
Agree to terms on the trade, but it can't become official until the new league year.
You can even make an official trade still right now. As long as you're using this year's salaries and it's all legal and works. That happened a couple years ago. Detroit did that. The league frowns upon it. They don't really want trades being made during the finals, but you can. There's nothing that says you can't do that. But what the loophole they closed is all of the apron rules kick in upon the end of your season this year. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to close it off from being like, hey, well, we have a week here at the draft. Let's get in all these trades where, we wouldn't be able to do this in a couple more days. They've closed that loophole off. So that's why you heard probably quite a bit of discussion around when Damian Lillard and Drew Holiday were traded, and Drew Holiday then was traded to Boston, around the concept of this is something these teams couldn't do next year because of all these increased rules. You can't aggregate salaries together. You can't take back more money than you send out and all those things as apron teams. So it was kind of, the idea was, we're going to give you a year. The NBA's thought was, let's give everybody a year to kind of get their books in order so you're really ready to go. Then you had Boston, Phoenix, Milwaukee say, actually, let's blow straight through all of that. Last chance saloon time to do some of these things. We're going to do them all, and then we'll deal with the fallout on the back end of all that stuff. So really was a kind of...
Miami missed out on that, basically. So by not getting...
To an extent. Now, the good thing is Donovan Mitchell, if you're trading for a guy like him, you're not going to make that trade and still have Jimmy Butler probably on the Heat. That's, I think, the easy way to do that. Like I said, if there's a team that can figure it out and get there, it's Miami. But it's just very, very hard if you're dealing with any kind of the apron challenges to make those moves.
If the Heat were then to, let's say, it's the first night of the draft, June 26th, and they were to salary dump, let's say, Tyler Hero to a team with cap space, that might be an indicator that they might have something lined up potentially for a Donovan Mitchell or a star trade. Because then that would get them, if they were to salary dump something like that, that would get them to where they need to be in terms of the apron.
Yeah, and to be very clear, that would be one of those agreed to things, and then it would be actually executed when the moratorium ends in the middle of the first week of July. So what would happen is they would agree to that trade of, and I'm just making it up, Tyler Hero into the Orlando Magic's cap space, and they're taking back, I don't know, we'll have fun with it, to draft rights to Fran Vasquez, who's now 40-something years old and retired. But let's just say we're taking back nothing, right? We're taking back no salary. Then what would happen is that it's less wiggle room, but it would accomplish the same thing. It gets them the clearance they need. Then they could go about saying, all right, let's figure out a way now.
And then they can aggregate trades, bring back a little bit more, and basically do a Donovan Mitchell deal.
Yep. Let's do it that way. Or at that point, it becomes an expanded, hey, actually, Cleveland, if we're going to trade for Donovan Mitchell, let's just do this as one big transaction where we're bringing in Mitchell, but Hero's going out to Orlando, and there's ways you could work it that way too. So, and that's where sometimes, if anybody who follows me will see, I will say sometimes when the initial trade news breaks, I am very famous on Twitter for saying, hold on, there's something else. There's got to be something else, because usually what I do is I start doing math, then I'm like, this doesn't quite work. As the kids say, the math's not mathing. Right. So then I'm like, where are we at with that? So then I start kind of thinking through it. And like, there was did you remember the big Pelicans? It was the Pelicans and the Bucks. It was the Drew Holiday trade, and Memphis got involved. David Griffin by the end expanded that. I think it ended up being a 4-team trade. It involved multiple sign-in trades, multiple guys getting moved all over the map. And he was really kind of the architect of saying, hey, we're going to do these individually, or the best way for all of us is let's all jump in one big trade and we'll do it this way. And that could be something that could happen. And what that does is it just angers people because then it's delayed. Like, why don't I see player X on my team's roster? And it's like, well, it's coming, but they're still working out the details. They're going to get there.
One last thing, Keith, and I really do appreciate the time. This has been awesome. But we mentioned a little bit Caleb Martin and Haywood Highsmith. Caleb's going to opt out. We know this. Highsmith is a free agent. They have the bird rights for both of these players.
Yep.
Correct? And so they can just sign them and to the max if they wanted to. What they would have to be worried about, Miami, would be, well, we're already a second apron team. How much deeper do we want to go into that second apron? And then obviously you've got the multipliers on their salaries that could turn a $10 million contract into a bajillion-dollar contract.
Yeah, that's the thing. And now there's one more level to the tax stuff. In the year in 25, 26, they redefined the tax bands, meaning what they did was if you're only a little into the tax, it's not quite as punitive as it used to be. But if you are a lot into the tax, it is way more punitive than it used to be. They basically took it from being, if you are like in a spot where you are $3 into the tax, like $3 per dollar into the tax, that's now like $4 per dollar into the tax. So the whole idea behind the CBA, it was two ways. It was to squeeze everybody back towards the middle. Everybody knows about the Warriors and the Clippers and what the Nets were becoming of. We don't want teams being super expensive. So they took those teams, push them down, right? We want you to be less expensive. But what they did was they added rules on the other side where if we remember back, San Antonio, Indiana would go into a season with $40 million of cap space left. Then they were everybody's third favorite team in every trade because it was like, hey, they can just take the bad contract. Now what happens is day one, let's say you're $40 million under the cap, you get a cap hold, an artificial cap hold put on your books that brings you up to the salary floor because they're trying to say, we don't want you sitting on cap space because that's not new money being spent. If you eat a contract, that's already out there. We want you to spend money. And they improve the value of the mid-level exceptions and the like. Those are worth more money. So they kind of took the top teams, pushed them down. Those cheaper teams pushed them up. I'm not going to say it's even like this for anybody watching on video. My hands are even, but it's a little bit less unbalanced than it used to be. And that's how they're going to try to force and drive some parity with rosters and the like that to kind of bring everybody a little bit back closer to the middle with how they spend.
Keith Smith, super informative. You can find his work over at Spotrac. You can find him on Twitter. His Twitter account is here on the YouTube channel. But if you're not watching, Keith Smith, NBA on Twitter. Thanks, man. This was awesome. Appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow us on your podcast app.